Okay, lesson 9, the final solution, part 1. Now we're getting into the real heart of many of the controversies that you could encounter on this examination. The final solution really comes, as many historians will tell you, out of the practicalities of war. In other words, perhaps had Hitler not invaded the Soviet Union, he wouldn't have felt in a position to carry out the final solution. And I suppose that even in and of itself is up for debate. Nevertheless, what Operation Barbarossa does, that is the the German invasion of Soviet Russia, is it does give Hitler the conditions in which he may finally achieve, or at least attempt to achieve, his vision of exterminating what becomes known as Jewish Bolshevism, or Bolshevik, and sort of win Lebensraum for the German people. The invasion itself, after being planned for approximately 7 months, is launched on the 22nd of June, 1941. This was, in many ways, the war he always wanted to fight. Hitler actually, ironically, finds himself on the invasion of Poland in an alliance with the Soviet Union and in the war against France and Britain, particularly Britain, countries he had no intention of being at war with. So in many ways, he ends up in the wrong war. When he invades the Soviet Union, this is really the fulfillment of his dream, the fight and war that he wanted. And victory over the Soviet Union would give Hitler undoubted control over all Europe and give him the opportunity to destroy Jewish Bolshevism, win Lebensraum, and fulfill his duty or his vision as outlined in Mein Kampf. As such, because this was supposed to be a different type of war, and in very many ways a final war, the stakes were total, and the war fought here in the East would be more brutal, more different, and more uncompromising, perhaps, than any other war that had been fought to this point in human history. The German troops advanced incredible distances. In fact, the logistical challenge facing the Nazi troops resupplying an army that's moving as fast as it does, that's as successful it does, is absolutely enormous. And behind the German troops, where we will focus, follow the SS units with special orders to wage an unprecedented campaign of murder against the communist officials and the Jews that they come across. And the launch of this campaign, Operation Barbarossa, is really the prelude to the Holocaust. The great question that remains, that really will occupy us, is when was the final solution ordered? How was the decision for genocide made? Was it ordered early on? Was it ordered at a later point once sort of Operation Barbarossa had sort of manifested itself? And how do we know? How was the decision made? Was it merely made as a sort of officializing of what was already being done, or was it made as a consequence of the top-down decision by Adolf Hitler? What we do know about this is Hitler's orders before June 1941 are such. Historian Richard Breitman claims that Hitler made the fateful decision to exterminate the Jews no later than January 1941, as he planned for Operation Barbarossa. It therefore became a matter of timing when he would sort of get this process underway. What really sort of hinders the Breitman account, and something you actually may even encounter the Breitman account, who knows, is the fact that he has little but circumstantial evidence to prove his case. There's almost no proof, either in writing or by studying the actions of key Nazi officials for the Holocaust, that any sort of dedicated plan had been reached and that Hitler had given an order, because simply the Nazis around him don't act like it. And given the lack of proof, most Holocaust historians think that the genocide decision came much later than Breitman thinks, sometime perhaps in the summer of 1941 or even as late as the fall of 1941. Yet what is absolutely in no doubt whatsoever is that historians all agree that Hitler was determined to defeat Jewish Bolshevism and destroy it entirely, and this was sort of an ancillary aspect of Operation Barbarossa. The secret directive of the 3rd of March 1941 also comes under consideration. The Army High Command is instructed to eliminate all the Bolshevik/Jewish intelligentsia in the same way as they had done in Poland. So in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the Army Command is instructed to do so. There's little opposition, unlike there was in Poland, to such orders, because the generals at this time, number one, had increasing faith in Hitler after the tremendous successes against the Poles in 1939, and then, of course, against the combined British and French forces in 1940. And therefore, they're more inclined and actually less in a position to speak out against Hitler because his success is so total that it gives him unprecedented authority. Most German officers, it needs to be said as well, don't question Hitler's orders in this respect because they share his hate of Bolshevism and the Judaism, which basically they saw was one and the same, and they also share his belief that this should be defeated at all costs. So many German officers see the conquest of Russia as a necessary thing to eradicate Germany of these evils. The Army accepts, as well as a consequence, that in the Soviet campaign, the SS should have special tasks, as it was often described, and that Heinrich Himmler should have special independent powers, independent of the governors and the Gauleiters of the conquered territories, to do as he pleased. Therefore, the Himmler's special tasks are encompassed by the fact that he orders the total elimination of active or passive resistance behind the German advance, and that all communist political commissars, the people who are really the eyes and ears and mouths of the party in the local regions of the Soviet Union, are to be shot on the spot. The Einsatzgruppen, who are tasked with doing this, are divided into small units called Einsatzkommandos. And these Einsatzkommandos are generally staffed by ordinary policemen taken from all over Germany and assigned to the Einsatzgruppen. The officers of these ordinary policemen are carefully picked and carefully assigned based on their ambition and their commitment to the Nazi regime. One good example is Otto Ohlendorf. One of the characteristics of these Einsatzgruppen leaders is the fact that these Einsatzgruppen commanders are overly educated. It's actually 3 of the 4 Einsatzgruppen divisions, A, B, C, and D, hold PhDs. Otto Ohlendorf, the man in the pictures here, has PhDs in law and economics, and his nickname among the Nazis is Dr. These people had been briefed by Himmler, and they knew exactly what they were to do, and even though their exact orders were a matter of controversy, a very characteristic fashion of how decisions were made in the Third Reich, a lot of the orders were verbal, and what exactly they were told and when to sort of unleash their pogroms is a matter of controversy. Another difficulty, I guess, confusing the record is that after 1945, the survivors gave often very conflicting evidence. For instance, at the trial of Otto Ohlendorf, those who worked for him gave conflicting evidence about when Ohlendorf ordered certain events, or when he was supposed to have found out his orders himself. Basically, they were all trying to save Ohlendorf from the gallows. And many of these people will eventually retract their quote-unquote false statements after Ohlendorf's execution because they wanted to tell a more pure version of the story, because their original stories had been, a matter of trying to save Ohlendorf from the execution. And in the end, we have a bunch of contradictory evidence, some people telling as many as 3 and 4 different versions of events. We just don't know which one is true. In fact, it is in their best interest to hide the truth. So therefore, the sort of oral testimonies in this vague mystery, which is when was the command given for the Holocaust, become very unreliable. And as such, the evidence is hard to decipher. So therefore, we get into the controversy even more. To complicate it even further, the members of the Einsatzgruppen did different things at different times. Typically speaking, after they entered a Soviet town, they rounded up the communist leaders and the Jews, and they shot them in the outskirts of the town. And in other cases, in areas of the Ukraine where anti-Semitism among the locals was deep-rooted, they allowed the locals to basically carry out, with Nazi-assisted pogrom-style killings. Einsatzgruppen leaders had been given the task of liquidating all potential enemies, including Jews, but by no means were all Jewish men and very few Jewish women killed. So therefore, how do we determine where the the order was given, certainly thinking if there was a final solution order at the time of the launch of the Soviet invasion anyhow, wouldn't they have killed all of the men, women, and children? But it's typical of the Einsatzgruppen that they only killed the men. Historian Philip Burin actually even doubts the very existence of a vague or implicit order. He basically thinks that the Einsatzgruppen did what they thought was right, so that they had no actual directive when Operation Barbarossa was launched. What we do know is that all of this sort of points to what historian Browning will call a quantum leap. But before we get to that, Burin points out that 3,000 men make up the total of the Einsatzgruppen. These men are trained in mass killing techniques, and they are hardly likely to be a sufficient amount to kill 5 million Jews, which was the total estimated amount of Jews in Russia at that time. So Burin says basically if the Einsatzgruppen were given a final solution order, they certainly were understaffed to do the job, and even the most, ridiculous estimate of how few it would take would put way more than 3,000 to kill 5 million people. Therefore, he doubts very strongly that even a vague order was given for the final solution at the launch of Operation Barbarossa. What historian Browning does confer is that this killing and the killing of the Einsatzgruppen and the pogroms that they started to initiate at this particular time amount to what he calls a quantum leap in the direction of genocide. And he agrees with Burin that there's a difference between the savage violence of the initial launch of the campaign and the systemic genocide. In addition, Soviet commissars are more likely to be shot on the spot than the Jews. So, much really depended on the individual on the spot. If the individual Einsatzgruppen commander was particularly anti-Semitic, the Jews were killed as well. If the other one was concerned with the Soviets primarily, the Jews were left alone and the Soviets were killed. And local people also commit some of the first and worst of the mass killings. Basically, what the Nazis' invasion in many ways allowed for local people whose hatred of the Jews ran for centuries to basically get away with the killing that they had always wanted to do, and the Nazis just stood back. So in many ways, we don't really know in this chaotic early days of the operation whether or not there was a final solution order. The evidence seems to suggest perhaps that there isn't. The Einsatzgruppen and Wehrmacht officers decide really on an ad hoc basis the fate of each community they reach. Some communities are bypassed, some are wiped out, and some have their communists and Jews decimated, and the rest of them are left alone. It's really sort of all over the map. When things start to come more into the picture, some historians argue, is the 2nd of July 1941, based on the orders given by Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich orders that on the 2nd of July 1941, that Jews in the service of the party or state and other extremist elements are to be executed, and pogroms brought on by the locals are to be encouraged rather than prevented. By the 17th of July 1941, Heydrich orders that all Jews amongst Russian POWs are to be executed on the spot by the SS. Neither of these 2 points, though, necessarily prove the existence of a genocide order, but show that attitudes certainly were hardening in the East. What's more, Alfred Rosenberg, the head of the occupied Soviet Eastern territories, was not planning for genocide in July 1941. The final solution in his writings and in his testimony and in everything he seemed to be doing, it seemed to indicate that resettlement was still on the cards in July 1941. It seems likely that Hitler would have informed him had there been a decision to eradicate or to have to commit genocide, especially considering he was in charge of millions upon millions of Jews. Himmler himself actually doesn't even seem to be preparing for genocide at this particular point. A July 1941 plan suggests he expected a period of brief killing, but then he envisioned a mass migration to follow. Himmler had a 30-year plan to remove 31 million people, including Jews, in fact, from these eastern territories beyond the Ural Mountains into Siberia, and then to replace them in this land with what would amount to 4.5 million ethnic Germans. And the final evidence that sort of proves a lack of order in July even was that by mid-August only 50,000 Soviet Jews were killed compared to the 500,000 who were killed in the next 4 months. So there seems to be a real escalation after July of killing. So perhaps the orders in July hadn't perhaps happened to this point. Where the transition goes into mass slaughter is also a matter of controversy. Browning believes that Hitler, elated and confident that the USSR was on the verge of defeat, gave signals to carry out racial cleansing in mid-July 1941. But in July 1941, in fact, the Nazis had been so successful that they were on the outskirts of Moscow, and Hitler seemed to believe that the Soviets were about to fall or surrender any day. And therefore, he believes that in this elation, Hitler believes that he basically jumps the gun a bit, and he says, well, now that we're about to win the Soviet Union, here's what needs to happen. And he basically says that at some point in mid-July 1941, Hitler would issue a Holocaust order. And his evidence is such. He no longer had to worry about world opinion. Himmler and Heydrich are in close proximity to Hitler and are at his headquarters quite frequently between 15 and 20 July. And this certainly would have given Hitler an ideal time to communicate this order to the two most important men in the organization of the Holocaust. Additionally, Hitler will commit in July 2 SS brigades, 60,000 additional men to assist the Einsatzgruppen, which is a sufficient number by all estimates to kill en masse. By August 1941, Himmler will travel through much of the Eastern Territory and issue personal instructions, which probably explain why different Einsatzgruppen leaders learn of a turn in policy at different times, and that, you know, Himmler, with a vague instruction by Hitler, will then just sort of pass on what he wants them to do. And of course, because he can't talk to them all at the same time, he will go and meet them one by one. And this will then lead to varying starting points for this new policy and explain why there's not a coherent date in which all of the people start to kill en masse. What's certain, though, is that by late August, killing increases on a scale not previously seen, and in a way that's very different. You have hundreds killed at a time in mass graves. Many of these mass graves dug themselves, whereas before people were taken to the outskirts of town. Many of them had a gun put to the back of their head and they were shot in the brainstem. At this particular point now, you have Jews by the hundreds digging their own graves, kneeling at the edge of them, and being executed by large masses of men by firing squad, where they fall into the graves they just dug, and more Jews are brought in to fill these places until the grave is full. What this is a difference in tactics in late August than anything that had become previous June and July of 1941. So Browning sort of cites this as evidence of a decision being made at this particular time. Where things, of course, get a little bit more muddy is what Hitler had in store for Jews outside of Russia. It's pretty logical, perhaps, that he gave the order to kill all of the Jews in July 1941, not just Russians. The construction of the Polish death camps begin in the autumn of 1941, and the fact that the beginning of these usually comes sometime after an order. Of course, it's a logistical issue. You ordered the construction of Auschwitz, for instance. You've got to find the bricks, you've got to lay the railway tracks, you've got to find people to build it, and this is not something that can happen in an instant. It takes several months to organize this sort of large-scale construction projects. Not to mention the fact that the Eichmann testimony and the testimony of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, indicate that they learned of the order in September 1941, and both of them, at different times after the war, testify that this was when they learned of the order. And Browning emphasizes that, again, the potential euphoria of victory or potential victory induced the Nazis to set a process in motion at this particular time. There is also another piece of evidence that some historians look at. The July 1931 order of what becomes known as the Göring document. This is quite interesting, actually. Göring is said to have washed his hands of the Holocaust. He didn't want any part of it. He would work and obviously contribute to it, but he sort of, you know, admonishes or sort of abdicates responsibility. That's the word I'm looking for. And what we see here is a really interesting order, and the one that confuses a few people, and it confuses historians who still argue over this. Heydrich writes a document. Actually, interestingly enough, he gives orders to himself, and these orders are supposed to have been from Göring, which are orders to prepare the final solution of the Jewish question. Historians Hillenberg and Browning agree that this letter by Himmler is a critical turning point, and this indicates that Heydrich now knew how that he had a challenge beyond just the Einsatzgruppen massacres. And this killing, or this document, seems to have been something that he would have been able to use and to show people and to have justified what he did. So effectively, he gives orders to himself, Heinrich does, and Göring abdicates responsibility. And this seems to indicate to many historians that there is a knowledge that a larger task is at hand, rather than just killing the Jews you come across in Russia. Others, on the other hand, disagree. They think that the document is simply a representation, an extension of Heinrich's responsibility for the Jewish question beyond Germany's borders, and something that perhaps he needed in formal writing. Neither Göring or Heinrich behave in the days after the July 1931 document like a decision had been made. There are no signs in August at all of frenzied activity to organize the final solution. And Göring is still talking in mid-August, in many cases, well-documented ones in fact, of the Jews being confined to labor camps, or hanging condemned Jews like criminals rather than shooting them honorably. So in many ways, why would he go about worrying about how Jews were going to be killed, which, if a final solution order was there, certainly that would indicate irrelevance. In fact, it would be completely irrelevant if they're all going to be killed anyway, how they were going to be killed. So the fact that Göring is acting and talking about these things at this particular time seems to indicate that perhaps in July there was no order given. So what the historians who counter Browning really come out with is the fact that perhaps the final solution order came at a different time, a time of desperation rather than elation. Byrne and Kershaw argue that the surge of killings do not mean that Hitler decided to kill all the Jews at this particular time in the summer of 1941. Byrne and Kershaw argue that the decision came later, perhaps in September or October of 1941. Byrne suggests that the decision-making process had not been finalized. Kershaw adds that the signs of actual planning are not evident at all before October. And he also believes that Hitler decided, out of pure desperation rather than elation, that the final solution needed to happen. Barbarossa, which goes incredibly well in the first 2 months of June, July, and actually into August 1941, really bogs down. The Russians don't give up. In fact, when Hitler believes in August 1941 Moscow is about to fall, it doesn't. And the Russians get stronger and stronger and stronger. And the longer the USSR holds out, the greater danger of things getting chaotic behind the lines. Now, if the Russians are still a factor, they're not surrendered, there is no impetus for the civilians that the Germans have conquered to give in, which increases the likelihood of a guerrilla war starting behind the lines. Therefore, Kershaw argues that there's a need to keep the occupied areas under control. Therefore, there is a need for harsher methods to be taken for all people in these occupied areas. And to this, he links a decision for the final solution. Not to mention the fact that German casualties start to rise in the autumn of 1941. The easy, quick victories of the first couple months turn to a brutal life-or-death struggle, with millions of Germans dying in this campaign with 1 million Germans, I should say, dying by autumn of 1941. And Byrne, to this effect, states that Hitler decided that the Jews would have to foot the bill for the spilling of so much German blood. He says the decision arises here from a murderous rage increasingly exacerbated by the ordeal of failure in his Russian campaign. And he figures that Hitler thought by killing his archetypal enemies, he was demonstrating his will to fight to the end. Jewish historian Arno Mayer also believes that the decision was made out of bewilderment and fear in the face of possible defeat. So we see those people who argue that the decision came in the autumn of 1941 are on the other side of Browning. They argue that the decision actually came from desperation rather than elation. So where is it? Where is the decision made? Was it made in July, or was it made sometime in the fall, sometime in September, October 1941? Browning believes that Hitler probably gave 2 orders. And here you get a really hybrid. So Browning's not willing to give up his first viewpoint. He still thinks that there's an order in July 1941, and he holds true on his evidence. He believes that Hitler probably gave 2. Number 1, in July, he gave an order to kill all of the Russian Jews. And somewhere in September and October, his move fluctuates wildly based on German fortunes in the East. Sometime in that month, somewhere between the 18th of September and the 18th of October 1941, when the Germans start to push the Soviets back once again and have a little bit more military success, he orders a second great intensification of the Holocaust. How do we not know? And perhaps we're never going to know, because documentation is so scarce. Most of the chief people responsible for these decisions and responsible for the Holocaust are dead at the end of the war, and therefore this debate's probably going to go on and on and on. And it's important now to consider, if you get a source, what evidence they used to determine their conclusion in the interrogation of this source. Most historians now accept the pieces fall into place somewhere between the 18th of September and the 18th of October 1941. The vast majority of historians believe it was Hitler, too, who initiated the Holocaust, rather than something that was really totally an ad hoc decision taken on the ground, and that sort of escalates over time. Basically, their evidence is this. Nothing is radical. The Holocaust could have begun without Hitler's approval. Not only that, when Heydrich and Himmler find out, when they find out, we'll never know. We also know that Hitler operated in a very non-bureaucratic manner and issues a lot of verbal orders here. And the SS records of Himmler and Heydrich are mostly destroyed in 1945. So probably what we can assume is that little more than a nod or a vague agreement was given to either Heydrich, probably Himmler, at some point, and this was all it took to initiate the Holocaust. And though, it probably could have happened in stages, it could have happened in July, but most historians tend to think it happened some point between September and October 1941. So what influenced Hitler's decisions? The conditions in 1941 were definitely propelling him towards a violent solution. Hitler, as the Nazi troops move east, is now in control of millions and millions of Jews. The conditions of the ghettos, which had housed the Jews who had fallen under his control from 1939 in Poland, were getting worse and worse. Epidemics of typhus were breaking out in the ghettos. And therefore, something needed to be done because these typhoid epidemics were threatening to spread. The slaughter of Soviet Jews also meant that it was a small step for him to rationalize the killing of all Jews. In many ways, too, he could have been pushed to some degree by the fact that the killings were already going on. And of course, by the time that the whole 1941 is in play, the whole world's at war with him anyway. So what does he care about world opinion anymore? So therefore, the sort of constraints of politics are really removed from him. He probably gives vague instructions and leaves it to Goering and Himmler to sort out. Goering, of course, wipes his hands of the issue in August 41, which may indicate a Hitler order in July, who knows. And the fact is that it would take the coordination of various state agencies, which proves that, more than anything, this was probably Hitler's decision. To get as many state agencies, the rails, the logistics, the SS, the army, to all work together towards the final solution would have to have meant that there was an order from Hitler somewhere. And most of the people who were interviewed after the war, of course, say they took part in this, they organized the trains because they were obeying orders from Himmler, who in turn was following Hitler's orders. And we do know that Himmler follows Hitler's orders very slavishly, which seems to indicate that there was an order at some point from Hitler. And the fact that even though we have no direct evidence for the Holocaust, we can assume that Hitler is ultimately, or had made a decision, and he had made that decision in some form, and therefore the Holocaust came at one point or another from Hitler's mouth. Whether or not he was pushed into it is one thing. What we can say for sure is that Hitler did make a decision on this. He wasn't silent on this issue at all. So the final solution in the USSR, by the mid-August 1941, the Einsatzgruppen units interpret their task very broadly as the killing of all Jews. They take precise records. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of examples about this. A couple examples not mentioned in this PowerPoint. Karl Jaeger, head of Einsatzkommando 3 of Einsatzgruppen A, kept extensive execution records. In July 1941, his commando killed 4,293 Jews, of whom 135 were women. In September 41, by contrast, his commando killed 56,459 Jews, 15,104 of which were men, 26,243 were women, and 15,112 were children. By November 25, Jaeger reports that the number of deaths in his remit were 1,064 communists, 56 partisans, 653 mentally ill, 44 Poles, 28 Russian prisoners, 5 Gypsies, 1 Armenian, and 136,421 Jews. Perhaps the most notorious killing of them all took place in Kiev. This is the third largest city in the USSR in September 1941. A few days after the capture of the city, on September 19, 1941, a huge explosion kills a whole bunch of German soldiers and officers in the German Army headquarters, which was in the Continental Hotel in downtown Kiev. A reprisal killing is initiated after this, where 33,771 Jews are shot over a 3-day period on a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev. The final solution in the USSR was obviously brutal and escalated very, very quickly. To what degree was the German army responsible? One of the things, and the German army was very clear after the war that they wanted to wash their hands of the Holocaust, but the records very much prove that they're complicit in all aspects. Auxiliary forces are recruited by the Wehrmacht from the people of the Baltic states and the Ukraine, who become willing executioners on their behalf. Also, the other important thing is that there are also thousands of ordinary German soldiers who actively take part in these pogrom-style killings. The Army High Command on the 20th of October 1941 instructs its field commanders to issue orders to kill all Jews, basically to take on tasks beyond purely military ones. After the war, the Wehrmacht, again, as I mentioned, tries to hide the fact that they were involved in this, but when you really look at the record, they're complicit on every level. Some undertake a brutal cleansing on their own initiative. The fighting in the USSR most certainly was brutal, and there seems to be a very direct link between the brutality of the fighting between the Germans and the Russians and a dehumanization of the average German soldier. For many of these people, basic social norms, rules, morality just doesn't apply in the East. And in the eyes of most German soldiers, the only good Jew is one who is dead. The brutality in the East will remain constant and true between 1941 and 1945. Some Jews escaped the immediate death due to the economic conditions, but once they could no longer work, many of these people were either killed or died. And even those who were forced into labor working for the Nazis were granted little more than a stay of execution to their eventual death. The numbers killed in the USSR are absolutely staggering. And in fact, we can only estimate the numbers of those killed. In some cases, we have detailed records, and other ones we just have to go by our best estimates of who was there before the war and the degree to which these communities were completely wiped out. Between June 41 and April 42 in the USSR, 750,000 Jews were murdered. Between 1942 and 1943, in a second sweep of the USSR to get all of the Jews, an additional 1.5 million people are murdered. These are people who are not killed in death camps. These are people murdered outright. A variety of methods are used. Some are shot. In fact, most of them are shot. By 1942, it becomes policy that they dig a huge hole, most of it done by a digger, and then Germans with machine guns set up around the hole. Jews are sort of herded to the edge of the hole and machine gunned into the hole. Some died in gas vans, where sort of carbon monoxide gas is pumped into the back of the van, killing people, everyone in the van. And others are just merely worked to death. The fate of the other people in the occupied zones depends largely on where they come from in the Nazis' racial scale. Latvians and Lithuanians are considered partially German. Some of those areas had been part of the German Reich before World War I, and they got off relatively easy. On the other hand, the Ukrainians, who, like the Poles, were considered inferior on the racial ladder, suffer a similar terror and a similar brutality to that we talked about in the last lesson when we looked at the situation in Poland. Slave labor and execution for trivial disobedience was the norm for the overwhelming amount of Ukrainians, and many millions will, many hundreds of thousands of these people will die, close to 1 million in fact, and tens of thousands of able-bodied Ukrainians will be transported to Germany, where they'll basically be worked to death as slave laborers in German factories. We'll continue next lesson by looking at the fate of German Jews and the sort of transition to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, with a talk about the Wannsee Conference and the organization of the final solution. But that's all for this lesson.